majority for one party or the other. From the point of view of Northern Ireland, we are more likely to have our special needs attended to and considered if we have our importance in the House of Commons as we do at the moment. And until there is a very big change in the Conservative Party as I now observe it, I do not believe that it is likely to cope more successfully with the major issues before the nation than the present administration with all its imperfections.
Judith Hart?
And what various individuals will do in terms of support of the Labour government, but we shall survive, and people must understand that. There's no question of this Labour government going within the next month or two. We shall be here for a year or two.
Lord Reverend? Yes, sir. No. Thank you very much. Yes, do. Yes. Hold on. Yes, sir. There is no need to shout. Right, hold on. Thank you very much indeed for putting your question. I don't know whether the listeners actually heard the question because it's very difficult to hear, but I think Judith Hart would like to answer it too.
I was being asked from the back of the hall why I joined a platform with Mr. Enoch Powell tonight and why I did not withdraw from the programme. May I say that I think that would have been a most foolish thing for me to do. I don't know whether we shall discuss questions concerning racialism here tonight. It will depend on what the questions are. If we do, I would rather be here to argue with Mr. Powell so that listeners can hear the other side of the argument than not be here. And moreover, given that fascism in this country, and I'm talking now particularly about the National Front, seeks to suppress free speech, I think it is of the greatest importance that we preserve the free speech of discussion in all the media. So I think it was wrong to ask me to withdraw.
Right, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Let's move over now, if we may, to Lord Reverend. Yes. Could I just say something now? There's a lot of noise going on outside. There's a lot of noise going on inside. What I would like to just say is this. I may have said it before in this program, but you'll know this program is listened to by a lot more people than are in this hall. But that doesn't mean to say that the people in this hall aren't a very good representative of the listeners. Now, that may be so. That may well be so, sir. But, no, just hold on. Now, hold on. Could I just say this? What now?
Don't do your own case such damage.
All I say now, before we move on, is please do not try to enhance that which you wish to diminish by making a fool of yourself, and let's get on with the programme. Lord Reverend.
One of the gravest, I think one of the gravest problems facing this country is intolerance and the ability of a very... and the ability of a tiny minority who represent nobody but themselves to interfere with the freedom and the rights of other people. And I start with that. Now,
This, ladies and gentlemen of the listening public, is rather like being in some sort of variety hall. Gentlemen are popping up from all sorts of parts of the hall, and I suppose we will manage to carry on. We will. Bishop, I'm sure that the Bishop here, if you'll allow me, Lord Reverend, Bishop, I'm sure you have a way of calming down people. Bishop. Oh, gentlemen, do stop it.
I think it seems a little silly to imagine that we should separate ourselves from one another on this small platform when we can't separate ourselves from one another in a very small nation, nor even in a very small globe. We are here as neighbours. We have to learn to live together with people with different opinions and to discuss them with some rationality.
Ladies and gentlemen at home, I do apologise about this. We will continue, and it won't take too long. But, you know, it had to start at some point. Lord Ravens?
Well, let's apply ourselves to the question of how long does the panel think the government will last. My own view is that they could easily go to the end of their term. A government can only be removed from office if in Parliament there is a vote of no confidence in it. And the government only needs a one majority to remain in power. And I do not see, with the present disposition of the parliamentary forces, that it would be possible for the present Parliament to carry a vote of no confidence. So I think, therefore, that this government is likely to go on probably to the end of its term.
Thank you very much. Let's move on, please, to another question.
John Kelly, what are the team's views on the proposed amendments to the marriage service, and given the chance, what amendments would they make?
Thank you very much. What are your views on the proposed amendments to the marriage service? And given the chance, what amendments would you make? Well, Bishop, what are the proposed amendments?
Mainly a modernisation of language, a clearer recognition of the facts of life, instead of wrapping them up in rather evasive phrases. I think the fact that people are going to love one another physically as well as mentally and spiritually is faced in the service. There's a certain lack of style perhaps in the language, but I think there's a general move towards humanity, making the thing more real to ordinary people.
Bishop, I'm sorry to do this, but would you just say a couple of words, please, on what it means? I happen to be sitting here on the stage of a church, and when people throw stones through the stained glass windows of a church, I feel sad, and I'd like you just to say a couple of words about that. There you are.
I think that, as usual, if the church is doing its job, it is standing in for humanity. It doesn't worry me that it was a stained glass window that was smashed, but that this window is typical of all the windows that are smashed when people become irrational. It doesn't worry me that Christ is pilloried or that his religion is brought into disrepute, but that it is the human relationship of society that is at threat. He stands in for the rest of us, and I think that's what we're seeing here tonight.
Well, I'm sorry we've lost the programme of Any Questions from Basingstoke. Perhaps, anyway, it was an appropriate time to leave. I think you'll agree that matters were becoming a little difficult there. We'll keep in touch with them, and if things improve, of course, we will return as soon as possible. In the hall, in Any Questions, we've had to leave the programme. We hope to be able to return there as soon as possible. In the meantime, we'll continue with some more music. Well, I'm afraid there's still no news from the hall in Any Questions coming this week from Basingstoke. We've had a disturbance there. You'll have heard if you've been listening already. If you've just tuned in, let me tell you we had to leave them, but we'll keep in touch and go back there, of course, just as soon as we can. Well, the King's Singers have been... More Tudor songs. We'll go on with those in a minute if we're unable to return to any questions. But in the hall at Basingstoke is one of our reporters, Graham Leach, and I understand we can go over to him now to find out the latest situation.
Well, Any Questions has been taken off the air this evening because of a demonstration inside the hall here. The demonstration came after the first question was asked. Mr. Powell was replying to the question on how long the present government would last. He answered his question, and then it was the turn of Mrs. Judith Hart, the Labour MP. She'd hardly begun starting to speak when a demonstrator from the hall stood up and asked her why she was sitting on the same platform as Mr. Powell and why she'd refused a request not to sit on the same panel with him. This deteriorated into a general free-for-all between the panel and the demonstrators. The panel could hardly talk, and there was a lot of shouting from the hall. One of the demonstrators wanted to know why only 20 tickets to the programme had been allowed to the Labour Party. And shortly after this, a stone was thrown through one of the stained glass windows of the church where the programme was taking place. A short time ago, the chairman of the programme, Mr. David Jacobs, took the panel from the hall. They're now in a back room, and at this stage it looks unlikely that the programme will continue for some time yet, if at all. And now back to John Marsh in London.
That was Graham Leach in Basingstoke. Just tuned in. Let me repeat once again that we're afraid we've had to leave the Any Questions programme this evening because of a disturbance in the hall. And as yet, we've still no word, I'm afraid, that we're able to go back and rejoin them. So we'll continue with some more music, and we'll have a little change now from the King's Singers, and move on to a piece of messages to the marriage service. So we'll go back there straight away.
They're beautiful, they're old, and if we ever get rid of all the things that we hold dear, we'll finish up like this bunch of rabble that tried to upset this meeting tonight.
Enoch Powell, are there any amendments that you would make to the marriage service?
I don't want to make amendments to the 1662 prayer book. The bishop used a very remarkable word, and that word was magic. He wanted magic in a service. Now the magic comes from the service or the words not being the words which we use in ordinary life, being words which are hallowed by the passage of time. And I simply have no patience with this idea that people won't understand them. People are perfectly capable of finding out the meaning of what they want to understand. There's no difficulty in explaining to anyone who wants to know what is the meaning of the Elizabethan and Jacobean phraseology of the prayer book. In any hobby, in any pursuit that people engage in, there is a jargon. There is a vocabulary which they're all delighted to learn and to use. And so there is in the church. And this notion that we have to make it easy, that we have to make it intelligible, which we have to make it modern, is really a surrender of the heart of what the church offers to people.
Bishop?
And I'm quite sure they said exactly the same thing in 1663.
Thank you very much.
And how much they lost in 1663, and that we have been trying to regain ever since. After all, the story of the Church of England since the Reformation has been the recovery of the Catholic inheritance, much of which, not all of which, it threw away, and which we have painfully regained. So I find no rebuke in the fact that in 1549 and 1662, people were in fact repelled by the new words, which they were then forced to use. But those then new words have for us become hallowed.
Let's leave that question and go on to another. Who's next?
C.J. Woodward. How can the principles of freedom of choice and freedom of conscience be reconciled with the closed shop system imposed by unions, whereby someone may be rendered unemployed or even unemployable because he does not want, for whatever reason, to join a union?
Thank you, Mr. Woodward. How can the principles of freedom of choice and freedom of conscience be reconciled with the closed shop system imposed by unions, whereby someone may be rendered unemployed or even unemployable because he doesn't...
Realities, whether you like them or not, have to be accepted. And one of the situations, you see, that one finds now is that Supposing a man doesn't want to join a union, but he wants to work in a given factory, and in that factory, in that workplace, his wages and the conditions of work and the privileges and the advantages that he has have been negotiated by the trade union, which is then saying, now look, if you come and work here, you are a member of our union. And there is something to me rather cowardly, frankly, about pretending that you can exercise freedom of conscience by contracting out, or wanting to contract out, of a situation in which you are prepared to take all the advantages that the others have got for you, while yourself saying, but I want to stay remote from it. And this is really what the closed shop issue is all about nowadays. There's nothing desperately opposed to freedom of conscience any more than anyone could say that their freedom of conscience was infringed by being a taxpayer. You can't contract out of being a taxpayer in the society in which you live, because you're taking the advantages which the taxes provide. And so I think this is really a rather a false argument. I don't think it's anything to do with freedom of conscience. I think it's much more to do with a few individuals who really would just like to have the best of both worlds, get the advantages, but do without the membership.
Well, Reverend.
I think that last point is really at the heart of the matter, that what we want and what I think the principle of the closed shop is after is that every worker should genuinely participate in the running of the union. It is the apathy, it is the non-participation of workers in their unions that has led to a great deal of the irresponsibility that may exist. I'm very hesitant myself, knowing myself to be totally middle class in all my vocabulary and all my outlook. I'm very hesitant to keep on throwing around words like freedom, the individual, conscience, and so on, in the way in which I have been brought up to use those words, without sympathy with a vast number of my fellow countrymen and my neighbours who, through their past history, have learned that it is only by solidarity that they have won any kind of freedom or any sort of individual life. For them, they exist in solidarity.
Betty Forrest, with a considerable proportion of our population too young to remember war, yet holding enlightened views on its folly and futility, how do the team suggest Remembrance Day might now be commemorated?
Betty Forrest wonders how you suggest Remembrance Day might now be commemorated. Lord Robbins?
I'm not sure that one can have a sort of blanket arrangement about this. I would see in the small towns and the small villages of this country a very different approach than you could have in the large cities. Essentially, I think that I would want to remove from the Remembrance Day celebrations the military aspect, which today is very much emphasized. I would rather see large groups of nice people, such as are in this hall now, that some of us have seen one or two people go out. Nice citizens of Basingstoke who come here, behave properly, and do all the things that are proper in personal conduct. I would rather see that grouping of people paying their silent tribute to men who have, and women who have given their lives in a war on behalf of their country. But I think they need to be simple services. I don't think they need to be military services, and I think they should have a very distinctive personal flavour about them. And that's why I would prefer not to have a sort of blanket arrangement, but rather that communities should decide themselves what manner in which they would remember those who lost their lives in defence of their country.
Judith Hart?
Yes, I think I do have. It's quite right. It commemorates death, do you know? And while we need to do that, what I would like, I think, is that we used the occasion, and indeed the days surrounding the occasion, to work for peace. Because, in fact, the best way of commemorating people who've died in war is to ensure that war doesn't happen again. And supposing we had a week like you're having in Basingstoke now, a cultural festival week, and supposing one had a conscious several days in every community when people were discussing the issues of peace and war, discussing how we keep the peace, discussing all the problems of peace and war, and made that our commemoration to the people who died in the last war. I think that would help the young people a great deal.
Well, there we have to leave this week's edition of Any Questions, which, if you were listening earlier, you'll have heard was interrupted by a disturbance in the hall. The members of the team this week were the Right Honourable Enoch Powell, MP, Lord Robens, the Right Honourable Judith Hart, MP, and the Bishop of Winchester. David Jacobs was the chairman, and the producer was Michael Bowen. And may I just say that I understand that they are, in fact, going to go on recording in Basingstoke now, and we hope to have a full programme for you for its next placing.
The Radio 4 programme, Any Questions, was faded out because of a noisy demonstration against one of the team, Mr. Enoch Powell. The chairman, David Jacobs, said it was his saddest moment in 30 years of broadcasting. At a meeting in the BBC Radio 4 show, Any Questions, was forced off the air last night by a furious demonstration against Mr. Powell. Protesters, it says, smashed stained glass windows at the church where the show was being staged. Several of the papers lead with the story by the final edition. Last night's raucous left-wing demonstration, which forced Radio 4's Any Questions programme off the air, has been condemned by the Labour MP, Mrs. Judith Hart, who was taking part in the programme. It was a live broadcast from a church in Basingstoke, and the protesters were angry at the presence of Mr. Enoch Powell, who was on the panel, along with Mrs. Hart, the Bishop of Winchester, and Lord Robens. They asked Mrs. Hart why she agreed to appear with Mr. Powell. Mrs. Hart said that while she disagreed with Mr. Powell's views, she thought it better to debate matters with him than stay away. But the demonstrators weren't satisfied, and they began continuous barracking, whilst from outside a stone was thrown through one of the church windows. Eventually the programme went off the air for about 20 minutes, while stewards cleared the demonstrators from the hall. Afterwards, Mrs. Hart said she was very upset that people who shared her political sympathies should have behaved in such a way.
I don't approve of these tactics. I think they damage the cause. I think they are very dangerous. And I think the people tonight, whoever they were and wherever they came from, were gravely mistaken in using that tactic to present a cause with which I wholly identify.